Welcome to the Wild West's most infamous gathering places, the saloons, the heart of Western towns, but behind the swinging doors lay a world of debauchery, violence, and corruption. Join me as we venture into the gritty reality of Wild West saloons. Saloons did not start as sophisticated hangouts. Their beginning was far humbler. They emerged in the 1820s, hidden in rough mining camps and isolated frontier outposts. The earliest recorded one, which opened in Browns Hole, Wyoming, in 1822, was a simple place, serving as a basic spot for travelers to grab a drink and share stories. As gold rush fever swept places like California in 1849 and Colorado during its mining boom, saloons became the heartbeat of these settlements. They weren't just bars. In developing communities lacking infrastructure, they also served as town halls, post offices, and even churches for Sunday services or election polling places. At first, these saloons were dusty tents in a mining camp. They gradually transformed into wooden shacks and then into solid structures as the town developed. By 1890, Denver alone boasted of 478 saloons, outnumbering churches and schools combined. This growth mirrored the railroad's expansion, bringing in workers who needed a place to rest after grueling days. But here's the twist. Unlike the shining mirrors and chandeliers we see in movies, most saloons were crude works. They were canvas tents in early camps, sod walls in prairie towns, or simple wooden frames elsewhere. And those famous bat-wing doors? They were not standard. In windy, dusty, or cold regions like the Great Plains, they were more nuisance than novelty, letting dust and cold to enter with every gust. As a result, many chose standard lockable doors to keep things secure. While a few city locations boasted ornate bars brought in from Cape Horn, for most patrons, the saloon served as a rough refuge rather than a glamorous venue. The average saloon was dim, smoky, and yes, often dirty, floors littered with sawdust to soak up spills and worse, and the air thick with tobacco and unwashed bodies. But before we go any further, if you're enjoying this and love stories about the Old West, don't forget to subscribe and share. Let's step through the door and see what really happened inside. Forget the constant gunfights shown in movie lore. There's much more to it than that. Drinking was the heartbeat of a saloon, and whiskey was king. This was not the smooth, oak-aged kind either. It was often cheap rotgut, brewed from whatever was on hand. Corn, rye, even cactus in the Southwest, and the prices varied wildly. Beer, when available, was considered a luxury due to refrigeration challenges prior to the 1880s. As for food, options were often limited to simple fare like hard-boiled eggs, pickled items, or stews. Saloons weren't restaurants. That aspect emerged later with free lunch counters to attract drinkers. Moving on, socially, saloons were male-dominated hubs for isolated workers. Cowboys, miners, railroad hands seeking companionship after months on the trail. During this period, tables were filled with endless rounds of poker or faro, often with high stakes, but sometimes just for bragging rights. This was also a place for business deals like land sales, job hiring, and even court proceedings when necessary. And if you were lucky, the place might have a piano professor playing lively tunes, along with a singer or a dancer. However, in the smallest towns, entertainment relied on the stories and songs that patrons shared among themselves. Yet this story continues. Stay tuned. Unlike Hollywood's glamorous portrayal of gunfights, brawls were common, caused by booze and egos. However, actual gunfights were rare, as most towns enforced strict gun control laws, requiring checks at the door. The West was actually more orderly than wild, with homicide rates in many regions lower than those found in modern cities. The area's diversity brought a unique flavor to life. Saloons served immigrants from China, Mexico, and Europe, although some towns had segregated areas. Black cowboys and Native Americans occasionally visited, but racism often restricted their access. So next time you watch a Western, remember, the real saloons weren't stages for endless shootout. They were lifelines, places of survival, shared stories, and a stiff drink to wash down the dust. And yes, there's still a lot to know. Let's move on. The dirt and grime of Wild West saloons. The Wild West saloon conjures images of polished bars, clinking glasses, and dramatic shootouts, thanks to Hollywood's polished lens. But let's remove the glamour and dive into the dirt and grime that defined these frontier drinking dens from the 1820s to the early 1900s. Far from romantic, saloons were often filthy, rough outposts of frontier life reflecting the raw, unpolished reality of the American West. The dust, sweat, and stench were as much a part of the experience as the whiskey, revealing a world where hygiene took a backseat to survival and socializing in the harsh, untamed landscape of the frontier. Saloons, starting as tents or shacks in mining camps or along trade routes, weren't architectural marvels. In early boomtowns, canvas tents or sod-walled structures served as saloons, barely shielding patrons from the elements. Dust storms on the Great Plains or mud from rainy seasons entered through gaps, covering everything from the tables and bottles to the people in soot. When wooden saloons emerged, they offered little improvement. The upgrade was merely cosmetic. They were hastily built with green timber, causing the building to be bent and cracked, allowing in wind, dirt, and vermin to enter. The floors were often just packed earth or, at best, covered with sawdust to absorb spills, spit, and worse. This sawdust wasn't changed daily, turning into a foul, soggy mix of tobacco juice, vomit, and spilled booze, continuously trampled by muddy boots. Cross the threshold, and the assault on your senses only intensifies. The air offered no relief. Ventilation was poor, and the windows, if present, were small and often boarded up to prevent break-ins or weather damage. Tobacco smoke hung thick, mingling with the odor of unwashed bodies. Cowboys, miners, and railroad workers, after weeks or months on trails or in camps, weren't exactly bathing regularly. Water was scarce in many regions, like the arid Southwest, and personal hygiene was a luxury. And not only that, the scent of cheap whiskey, often rotgut, combined with the occasional sharp musk of livestock, as horses or mules tied outside, sometimes wandered in. In colder climates, potbelly stoves burning wood or coal added soot and ash to the mix, coating lungs and surfaces alike. This wasn't atmosphere, it was endurance. And if you think the inside was bad, wait until you hear about the sanitation, or lack of it. Spittoons laid across on the floor, but hitting them was more of a suggestion than a certainty, leaving sticky, tobacco-stained puddles. Barrels of beer or whiskey, often stored in damp cellars or behind the bar, often leaked or grew mold. Glassware, when used, was rinsed in buckets of water that saw murky before being changed, if at all. In the remote saloons, hygiene slipped even further. Patrons often drank from shared tin cups or straight from the bottle, passing germs as freely as gossip. Food, like pickled eggs or stale biscuits, was left bare on the counters, attracting flies and dust. Outhouses, if they existed, were far away, so some patrons didn't bother, adding to the general filth. In mining towns, saloons near smelters or ore piles were coated with toxic residues like lead or arsenic, unbeknownst to the drinkers. And then there were the patrons, each bringing their own layer of filth. Miners, cowboys, and drifters packed saloons shoulder to shoulder, each carrying dirt, sweat, and stench from the trail. Brawls often left blood or broken teeth on the floor. Women working as barmaids or soiled doves battled their own dirt, with cheap makeup smudging in the heat and dresses stained from spilled drinks, or worse. The upstairs rooms or nearby cribs used for prostitution were frequently cramped, featuring unwashed linens and no ventilation, breeding grounds for lice and disease. The temperance movement, at its peak in the late 1800s, capitalized on this filth, painting saloons as cesspools of sin and disease, which fueled the push toward prohibition in 1920. However, for those in the frontier, the dirt was simply part of life, and saloons were where community thrived, messy as it was. So, next time you picture a Wild West saloon, forget the shiny Hollywood version. See the sawdust-caked floor, smell the sour whiskey and sweat, and feel the grit underfoot. That's the real West, dirty, raw, and unapologetically human. But as that part of the story ends, another begins. The patrons of Wild West saloons. Wild West saloons weren't just about whiskey and sawdust floors. They were defined by their patrons. Unlike the Hollywood stereotype of rugged cowboys and outlaws squaring off in gunfights, saloon-goers were a vibrant cross-section of frontier society. Miners, ranchers, immigrants, laborers, and more, each drawn to these rough and tumble establishments for respite, camaraderie, and survival. These saloons, whether canvas tents in mining camps or wooden shacks in budding towns, served as social lifelines in the isolated American West, reflecting its diversity, struggles, and fleeting moments of connection amid the dust and toil. The main patrons were men. Saloons were overwhelmingly male spaces, shaped by the frontier's harsh realities. Cowboys, often young and single, rode into town after months on cattle drives, ready to pay and also eager for a drink and company. They weren't the clean-cut heroes of westerns. They were dusty, sunburned, and reeking of sweat and livestock, seeking escape from grueling work. Miners, another mainstay, flooded saloons during gold and silver rushes from California in 1849 to Colorado's Pikes Peak in 1859. Covered in dirt from prospecting, they gambled their meager earnings on poker or faro, hoping for a big score or just a night's distraction. Railroad workers building the transcontinental lines were also regulars, especially in towns like Cheyenne or Ogden, where saloons lined the tracks. These laborers, often Irish or Chinese immigrants, spent their wages on cheap whiskey to ease the strain of grueling days. Here's something interesting. Diversity was a defining feature of the West, showcasing its melting pot nature. European immigrants, Germans, Italians, and Scandinavians mingled in saloons, each bringing their unique drinking customs. In California, Chinese miners frequented their own saloons due to racial exclusion, where they served rice-based liquors alongside whiskey. Mexican vaqueros, whose ranching skills heavily influenced cowboy culture, gathered in border town saloons, sometimes facing prejudice, but contributing to the cultural mix with tequila or pulque. Black cowboys, who made up about a quarter of the cattle industry, visited saloons where segregation wasn't always enforced, though instances of racism could arise. Native Americans occasionally came to trade and drink, but many saloons barred them due to local laws and prejudice. While this mix was not always harmonious and tensions around race or class could spark fights, saloons often provided rare spaces where diverse groups crossed paths. Saloons were a reflection of their patrons' lives, transient, tough, and diverse. A cowboy might spend his entire season's pay in one wild night, while a miner savored a single drink, lost in dreams of a strike. By the late 1800s, as towns expanded and temperance advocates condemned saloons as dens of vice, their role as all-encompassing gathering spots began to decline. The Prohibition of 1920 ultimately shut them down for good, yet their patrons, grimy, hopeful, and resilient, left behind a legacy of a West defined by shared drinks and stories, not just shootouts. The women of Wild West saloons. There is no tale without women. The women of Wild West saloons were far more complex than the sequined, flirtatious figures of popular imagination. From the 1820s to the early 1900s, these women, barmaids, dancers, prostitutes, and occasional proprietors, played critical roles in the rough-hewn saloons that served as social hubs of the American frontier. Their lives were shaped by economic necessity, societal constraints, and the gritty realities of the West, where survival often meant navigating a male-dominated, transient world with resilience and savvy. Women in saloons were primarily workers, not patrons, as social norms deemed these spaces improper for respectable women. Many were driven by poverty, widowhood, or lack of opportunity, drawn to boomtowns during gold rushes or along railroad routes. The most visible were barmaids and dancers, often young and single, who served drinks, entertained, and boosted saloon profits. They worked the room with practiced charm, coaxing patrons into buying overpriced drinks, sometimes nothing more than tea or tinted water disguised as liquor, allowing them to stay sharp while the customers loosened up. Every glass meant a commission, so they kept the conversation lively, flattering dusty cowboys, weary railroad men, and gold-hungry miners alike. But the job came with a cost, enduring crude remarks, wandering hands, and the constant din of smoky, sweat-stained saloons where the line between friendly banter and trouble could vanish in an instant. Prostitution was a reality for some, earning them the euphemism, soiled doves. These women worked upstairs in saloon rooms or in nearby cribs, small shacks for quick transactions. Not all barmaids or dancers engaged in sex work. Many were performers or servers, but the lines blurred in public perception and stigma clung to all saloon women. They faced harsh conditions like cramped, unventilated rooms, unwashed linens, and health risks like disease or pregnancy in an era of limited medical care. Yet for some, the work offered a path to independence, with earnings far higher than domestic service or sewing. The the few other options available. A few women rose above these roles to become saloon proprietors, defying gender norms. Figures like Mary Molly Tobin in Denver ran successful establishments, managing staff, finances, and rowdy patrons with authority. These women were rare but influential, often reinvesting profits into community ventures or other businesses, carving out respect in male-dominated towns. Saloons reflected the West's diversity, and so did their women. European immigrants, Mexican señoritas, and occasionally Black or Native American women worked in or frequented saloons, though racial prejudice often segregated spaces. Their presence added cultural layers, from Spanish songs to unique drinks, but also exposed them to discrimination or violence in tense frontier settings. Yet these women were survivors, not stereotypes, working in saloons to escape hardship, support families, or chase dreams in a West that offered few choices. Their legacy isn't in Hollywood's glitz, but in their grit, hustling through the dust and din to make a living. Stay tuned as we move on. Unauthorized activities in Wild West saloons. Though often romanticized as lively centers of whiskey and camaraderie from the 1820s to the early 1900s, Wild West saloons were equally notorious as breeding grounds for illicit activities that often defied the limits of frontier law and morality. Beyond the clink of glasses and piano tunes, these establishments, whether dusty tents in mining camps or wooden shacks in boomtowns, were venues for a host of illicit dealings. From gambling and prostitution to smuggling and fraud, saloons were often where the West's rough edges met, driven by the transient, diverse patrons and the loose oversight of fledgling towns. While rarely the lawless chaos of Hollywood myth, these unauthorized activities shaped the saloon's reputation as the frontier's gritty underbelly. Gambling was the most common illicit activity, thriving in nearly every saloon. Games like poker, faro, and monte drew cowboys, miners, and drifters, with stakes ranging from a few cents to entire season's wages. While card games weren't always illegal, many towns banned high-stakes gambling to curb violence and debt. Saloon keepers often evaded these laws, hosting games in back rooms or bribing local sheriffs to look the other way. Professional gamblers, or sharps, rigged games with marked cards or sleight of hand to swindle unsuspecting players, leading to heated disputes. Though brawls were common, fatal shootouts were far rarer than legend suggests, as many towns required patrons to check their guns upon entering. Prostitution, another widespread unauthorized activity, was deeply entwined with saloons. Women known as soiled doves worked upstairs or in adjacent cribs, offering services to lonely cowboys or miners. While tolerated in many towns, prostitution was often illegal, operating in a gray area where saloon keepers paid off authorities or faced raids. These women also hustled overpriced drinks, sometimes just tea masquerading as liquor, to boost profits, a practice that skirted fraud laws. The conditions were grim. Cramped, unsanitary rooms and health risks like venereal diseases were common, yet the trade thrived due to demand and economic desperation. Smuggling and black market dealings also found a home in saloons. In remote regions, saloons served as trading posts for illicit goods, stolen cattle, smuggled liquor, or even weapons. During the Indian Wars, some saloons illegally sold firearms or alcohol to Native Americans, defying federal bans and fueling tensions. In mining towns, shady dealers used saloons to fence stolen ore or sell fake claims, preying on hopeful prospectors. These transactions often happened in hushed corners or private rooms, with saloon keepers taking a cut for providing the space. Fraud extended to the drinks themselves. Cheap rotgut whiskey, sometimes diluted with water, turpentine, or worse, was a staple. Some saloon keepers passed off toxic concoctions as premium liquor, risking patrons' health. In unregulated frontier towns, such practices went unchecked, especially in temporary camps where oversight was non-existent. Violence, though exaggerated in myth, was another concern. Drunken brawls over cards, women, or insults were common, and while most were fistfights, some escalated to knife or gunplay, especially where law enforcement was weak. Saloons, as social centers, attracted a mix of immigrants, outlaws, and drifters living on society's edge. Weak governance and transient populations enabled illicit dealings to thrive, though some towns fought back with strict ordinances or vigilant marshals. These activities weren't mere lawlessness, They embodied the West's gritty reality, where survival often meant bending rules. In the smoky, crowded saloon, the frontier's struggle played out, blending camaraderie with vice in a way that defined the raw, unpolished spirit of the era. And we near the end, it is worth considering the enduring legacy of the Wild West Saloon, the legacy of Wild West saloons. Wild West saloons, thriving from the 1820s to the early 1900s, left a legacy far beyond their Hollywood image of swinging doors and shootouts. These gritty hubs, from tents in mining camps to sturdy buildings in boomtowns, were the heartbeat of frontier communities, shaping the American West's social, cultural, and economic fabric. Their influence lingers in modern culture, tourism, and our understanding of a rugged era defined by resilience and diversity. Let's take a closer look at how these iconic saloons shaped the West and continue to captivate us. Saloons were more than bars. They were the West's social glue. In isolated towns lacking churches or halls, they hosted everything: town meetings, elections, trials, even weddings. Cowboys, miners, immigrants, and drifters mingled here, forging connections that built communities. This role as a melting pot left a lasting mark, embedding the West's diverse identity: European immigrants, Mexican vaqueros, black cowboys, and Chinese laborers, into its cultural DNA. Saloons also empowered women in unexpected ways. Barmaids, dancers, and proprietors like Denver's Mary Molly Tobin carved out economic independence, challenging gender norms and inspiring stories of grit that resonate today. Not only that, economically, saloons were engines of frontier growth, powering boomtown economies as saloon keepers poured profits back into local businesses and infrastructure, often doubling as trading posts. Sometimes for contraband like smuggled liquor or stolen cattle, they helped establish commerce in regions where law was scarce. Yet their notoriety for vice-like gambling, prostitution, and fraud made them prime targets for the temperance movement, leading to prohibition in 1920, which ended the saloon era but cemented their infamous legacy. Today, saloons live on in cultural memory and tourism. Towns like Tombstone and Deadwood preserve or recreate saloons, drawing visitors with staged gunfights and period decor, though these often exaggerate the chaos. Western films, novels, and TV shows perpetuate the myths, from Gunsmoke to Westworld, but often gloss over the saloon's role as community anchors. Their true legacy lies in their reflection of the West's raw spirit, diverse, messy, and resilient, where people gathered to drink, deal, and dream, shaping a frontier that still captivates our imagination. And that's the untamed truth behind the Wild West Saloon, far more than swinging doors and barroom brawls. If you enjoyed this trip into history's smoky corners, hit that like button, share it with a fellow history friend, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales from the frontier. Until next time, keep your whiskey strong and your curiosity stronger.